Welcome to episode 7 of the podcast Ghosts, Demons, and Murder. Oh my. My name is Hayden Crook, and today's episode will be about Christmas ghost stories. And I am recording this a few days before Christmas. I have a little bit of free time left um, before I get busy with the holidays and festivities and all that. I did purchase a microphone on Amazon. It is supposed to be a condenser microphone, which cuts out background noise and just makes the audio quality a lot better. So hopefully this sounds good. The last couple times I've been just recording through my speakers and microphone in my laptop. I'm not sure really how the quality's been, but hopefully I set up all this right and everything's working good. Um, So yeah, this is episode 7, Christmas ghost stories. I kind of talked about this in my last episode, how back in the day in England it was a popular tradition apparently to tell ghost stories on, I believe, Christmas Eve, what have you. So I'm gonna, I guess, resurrect that tradition and do that today for this episode. Let's see. Which one do I want to do first? I have four. I kind of briefly glanced over them. I didn't really read them in depth. It was hard to find a lot of stories like where I didn't have to pay money or like buy books to read them. Like specifically like Christmas ghost stories, not just like random ones that people wrote, but stuff that's been published in magazines, newspapers, and whatnot. So I'll do this one first. It's called The Kit Bag by Algernon Blackwood. This story is from Pall Mall Magazine, December of 1908. And the story begins when the words not guilty sounded through the crowded courtroom that dark December afternoon. Arthur Wilbraham, the great criminal KC and leader for the triumphant defense, was represented by his junior. But Johnson, his private secretary, carried the verdict across to his chambers like lightning. It is what we expected, I think, said the barrister without emotion. And personally, I'm glad the case is over. There was no particular sign of pleasure that his defense of John Turk, the murderer, on a plea of insanity had been successful, for no doubt he felt, as everybody who had watched the case felt, that no man had ever deserved the gallows. I'm glad too, said Johnson. He had sat in the court for 10 days watching the face of the man who had carried out with callous detail one of the most brutal and cold-blooded murders of recent years. The counsel glanced up at his secretary. They were more that they were more than employer and employed. For family and other reasons they were friends. Ah, I remember, yes, he said with a kind smile. And you want to get away for Christmas? You're going to skate and ski in the Alps, aren't you? If I was your age, I'd come with you. Johnson laughed shortly. He was a young man of 26 with a delicate face like a girl's. I can catch the morning boat now, he said, but that's not the reason I'm glad the trial is over. I'm glad it is over because I've seen the last of that man's dreadful face. It positively haunted me. The white skin with the black hair brushed low over the forehead is a thing I shall never forget. And the description of the way the dismembered body was crammed and packed with lime into that. Don't dwell on it, my dear fellow, interrupted the other, looking at him curiously out of his keen eyes. Don't think about it. Such pictures have a trick of coming back when one least wants them. He paused a moment. Now go, he added presently, and enjoy your holiday. I shall want all your energy for my parliamentary work when you get back. And don't break your neck skiing. Johnson shook hands and took his leave. At the door, he turned suddenly. I knew there was something I wanted to ask you, he said. Would you mind lending me one of your kit bags? It's too late to get one tonight, and I leave in the morning before the shops are open. Of course, I'll send Henry over with it to your rooms. You shall have it the moment I get home. I promise to take great care of it, said Johnson gratefully, delighted to think that within 30 hours he would be nearing the brilliant sunshine of the high Alps in winter. The thought of that criminal court was like an evil dream in his mind. He dined at his club and went on to Bloomsbury, where he occupied the top floor in one of those old gaunt houses in which the rooms are large and lofty. The floor below his own was vacant and unfurnished, and below that were other lodgers whom he did not know. It was cheerless, and he looked forward heartily to a change. The night was even more cheerless. It was miserable, and few people were about. A cold, sleety rain was driving down the streets before the keenest east wind he had ever felt. It held dismally among the big, gloomy houses of the great squares, and when he reached his rooms, he heard it whistling and shouting over the world of black roofs beyond his windows. In the hall, he met his landlady, shading a candle from the draughts with her thin hand. "This come by a man from Mr. Wilbraham, sir." She pointed to what was evidently the kit bag, and Johnson thanked her and took it upstairs with him. I shall be going abroad in the morning for 10 days, Mrs. Monks, he said. "I'll leave an address for letters." "And I hope you'll have a Merry Christmas, sir," she said, in a raucous, wheezy voice that suggested spirits in better weather than this. "I hope so too," replied her lodger, shuddering a little as the wind went roaring down the street outside. When he got upstairs, he heard the sleet volleying against the window panes. He put his kettle on to make a cup of hot coffee, and then set about putting a few things in order for his absence. "And now I must pack, such as my packing is," he laughed to himself, and set to work at once. He liked the packing, for it brought the snow mountain so vividly before him. It made him forget the unpleasant scenes of the past 10 days. Besides, it was not elaborate in nature. His friend had lent him the very thing, a stout canvas kit bag, sack shaped with holes around the neck for the brass bar and padlock. It was a bit shapeless, true, and not much to look at, but its capacity was unlimited, and there was no need to pack carefully. He shoved in his waterproof coat, his fur cap and gloves, his skates and climbing boots, his sweaters, snow boots, and ear caps. And then on the top of these, he piled his woolen shirts and underwear, his thick socks, puttees, and knickerbockers. The dress suit came next, in case the hotel people dressed for dinner, and then thinking of the best way to pack his white shirts, he paused a moment to reflect. "That's the worst of these kit bags," he mused vaguely, standing in the center of the sitting room where he'd come to fetch some string. It was after 10 o'clock. A furious gust of wind rattled the windows, as though to hurry him up, and he thought with pity of the poor Londoners whose Christmas would be spent in such a climate, whilst he was skimming over snowy slopes in bright sunshine, and dancing in the evening with rosy-cheeked girls. Ah, that reminded him. He must put in his dancing pumps and evening socks. He crossed over from his sitting room to the cupboard on the landing where he kept his linen, and as he did, he heard someone coming softly up the stairs. He stood, he stood still a moment on the landing to listen. It was Mrs. Monk's step, he thought. She must be coming up with the last post. But then the steps ceased suddenly, and he heard no more. They were at least 2 flights down, and he came to the conclusion that they were too heavy to be those of his bibulous landlady. No doubt they belonged to a late lodger who had mistaken his floor. He went to his bedroom and packed his pumps and dress shirts as best he could. The kit bag by this time was two-thirds full and stood upright on its own base like a sack of flour. For the first time he noticed that it was old and dirty, the canvas faded and worn, and that it had obviously been subjected to rather rough treatment. It was not a very nice bag to have sent him, certainly not a new one, or one that his chief valued. He gave the matter a passing thought and went on with his packing. Once or twice, however, he caught himself wondering who could have been wandering down below, for Mrs. Monks had not come up with letters, and the floor was empty and unfurnished. From time to time, moreover, he was almost certain he heard a soft tread of someone padding about over the bare boards, cautiously, stealthily, as silently as possible, and further, that the sounds had been lately coming distinctly nearer. For the first time in his life, he began to feel a little creepy. Then, as though to emphasize this feeling, an odd thing happened. As he left the bedroom, having just packed his recalcitrant white shirts, he noticed that the top of the kit bag lopped over towards him with an extraordinary resemblance to a human face. The canvas fell into a fold like a nose and forehead, and the brass rings for the padlock just filled the position of the eyes. A shadow, or was it a travel stain? For he could not tell exactly, looked like hair. It gave him rather a turn, for it was so absurdly, so outrageously like the face of John Turk, the murderer. He laughed and went to the front room where the light was stronger. That horrid case has got on my mind, he thought. I shall be glad of a change of scene and air. In the sitting room, however, he was now pleased to hear again that stealthy tread upon the stairs, and to realize that it was much closer than before, as well as unmistakably real. And this time he got up and went out to see who it could be creeping about on the upper staircase at so late an hour. But the sound ceased. There was no one visible on the stairs. He went to the floor below, not without trepidation, and turned on the electric light to make sure that no one was hiding in the empty rooms of the unoccupied suite. There was not a stick of furniture large enough to hide a dog. Then he called over the banisters to Mrs. Monk, but there was no answer, and his voice echoed down into the dark vault of the house, and was lost in the roar of the gale that howled outside. Everyone was in bed and asleep, everyone except himself, and the owner of the soft and stealthy tread. My absurd imagination, I suppose, he thought. It must have been the wind after all, although it seemed so very real and close, I thought. He went back to his packing. It was by this time getting on towards midnight. He drank his coffee up and lit another pipe, the last before turning in. It is difficult to say exactly at what point fear begins, when the causes of the fear are not plainly before the eyes. Impressions gather on the surface of the mind, film by film, as ice gathers upon the surface of still water, but often so lightly that they claim no definite recognition from the consciousness. Then a point is reached where the accumulated impressions become a definite emotion, and the mind realizes that something has happened. With something of a start, Johnson suddenly recognized that he felt nervous, oddly nervous. Also, that for some time past the causes of this feeling had been gathering slowly in his mind, but that he had only just reached the point where he was forced to acknowledge them. It was a singular and curious malaise that had come over him, and he hardly knew what to make of it. He felt as though he were doing something that was strongly objected to by another person, moreover, who had some right to object. It was a most disturbing and disagreeable feeling, not unlike the persistent promptings of conscience, almost in fact as if he were doing something he knew to be wrong. Yet though he searched vigorously and honestly in his mind, he could nowhere lay his finger upon the secret of the growing uneasiness, and it perplexed him. More, it distressed and frightened him. Pure nerves, I suppose, he said aloud with a forced laugh. Mount air will cure all that. Ah, he added, still speaking to himself, and that reminds me, my snow glasses. He was standing by the door of the bedroom during this brief soliloquy. As he passed quickly towards the sitting room to fetch them from the cupboard, he saw out of the corner of his eye the indistinct outline of a figure standing on the stairs, a few feet from the top. It was someone in a stooping position, with one hand on the banisters and the face peering up towards the landing, and at the same moment he heard a shuffling footstep. The person who had been creeping about below all this time had at last come up to his own floor. Who in the world could it be, and what in the name of heaven did he want? Johnson caught his breath sharply and stood stock still. Then, after a few seconds' hesitation, he found his courage and turned to investigate. By stairs, or B stairs, he saw to his utter amazement, were empty. There was no one. He felt a series of cold shivers run over him, and something about the muscles of his legs gave a little and grew weak. For the space of several minutes, he peered steadily into the shadows that congregated about the top of the staircase where he had seen the figure, and then he walked fast, almost ran, in fact, into the light of the living room. But hardly had he passed inside the doorway when he heard someone come up the stairs behind him with a quick bound and go swiftly into his bedroom. It was a heavy, but at the same time a stealthy footstep, the tread of somebody who did not wish to be seen. And it was at this precise moment that the nervousness he had hitherto experienced leaped the boundary line and entered the state of fear, almost of acute, unreasoning fear. Before it turned into terror, there was a further boundary to cross, and beyond that again lay the region of pure horror. Johnson's position was an inevitable one. By Jove, that was someone on the stairs, he muttered, his flesh crawling all over, and whoever it was has now gone into my bedroom. His delicate, pale face turned absolutely white, and for some minutes he hardly knew what to think or do. Then he realized intuitively that delay only set a premium upon fear, and he crossed the landing boldly and went straight into the other room, where a few seconds before the steps had disappeared. "Who's there? Is that you, Mrs. Monks?" he called aloud as he went, and heard the first half of his words echo down the empty stairs, while the second half fell dead against the curtains in a room that apparently held no other human figure than his own. "Who's there?" he called again, in a voice unnecessarily loud and that only just held firm. "What do you want here?" The curtain swayed very slightly, and as he saw it, his heart felt as if it had almost missed a beat. Yet he dashed forward and threw them aside with a rush. A window, streaming with rain, was all that met his gaze. He continued his search, but in vain. The cupboards had nothing but rows of clothes. Hanging motionless and under the bed, there was no sign of anyone hiding. He stepped backwards into the middle of the room, and as he did so, something all but tripped him up. Turning with a sudden spring of alarm, he saw the kit bag. Odd, he thought. That's not where I left it. A few moments before, it had surely been on his right, between the bed and the bath. He did not remember having moved it. It was very curious. What in the world was the matter with everything? Were all his senses gone queer? A terrific gust of wind tore at the windows, dashing the sleet against the glass with the force of a small gunshot, and then fled away howling dismally over the waste of Bloomsbury roofs. A sudden vision of the Channel next day rose in his mind and recalled him sharply to realities. "There's no one here at any rate, that's quite clear," he exclaimed aloud. Yet at the same time he uttered them, he knew perfectly well that his words were not true, and that he did not believe that himself. He felt exactly as though someone was hiding close about him, watching all his movements, trying to hinder his packing in some way. "And two of my senses," he added, keeping up the pretense, "have played me the most absurd tricks. The steps I heard and the figure I saw were both entirely imaginary." He went back to the front room, poked the fire into a blaze, and sat down before it to think. What impressed him more than anything else was the fact that the kit bag was no longer where he had left it at. It had been dragged nearer to the door. What happened afterwards that night happened, of course, to a man already excited by fear, and was perceived by a man that had not the full and proper control, therefore, of the senses. Outwardly outwardly Johnson remained calm and master of himself to the end, pretending to the very last that everything he witnessed had a natural explanation, or was merely delusions of his tired nerves. But inwardly, in his very heart, he knew all along that someone had been hiding downstairs in the empty suite when he came in, that this person had watched his opportunity, and then stealthily made his way up to the bedroom, and that all he saw and heard afterwards, from the moving of the kit bag to, well, to the other things the story has to tell, were caused directly by the presence of this invisible person. And it was here, just when he most desired to keep his mind and thoughts controlled, that the vivid pictures received day after day upon the mental plates exposed in the courtroom of the Old Bailey came strongly to light and developed themselves in the dark room of his inner vision. Unpleasant, haunting memories have a way of coming to life again just when the mind least desires them. In the silent watches of the night, on sleepless pillows, during the lonely hours spent by sick and dying beds. And so now in the same way Johnson saw nothing but the dreadful face of John Turk, the murderer, lowering at him from every corner of his mental field of vision, the white skin, the evil eyes, and the fringe of black hair low over the forehead. All the pictures of those 10 days in court crowded back into his mind unbidden and very vivid. "This is all rubbish and nerves," he exclaimed at length, springing with sudden energy from his chair. "I shall finish my packing and go to bed. I am overwrought, overtired. No doubt at this rate I shall hear steps and things all night." But his face was deadly white all the same. He snatched up his field glasses and walked across to the bedroom, humming a music hall song as he went, a trifle too loud to be natural. And the instant he crossed the threshold and stood within the room, something turned cold about his heart, and he felt that every hair on his head stood up. The kit bag lay close in front of him, several feet nearer to the door than he had left it, and just over its crumpled top he saw a head and face slowly sinking down out of sight as though someone were crouching behind it to hide. And at the same moment, a sound like a long drawn sigh was distinctly audible in the still air about him between the gusts of the storm outside. Johnson had more courage and willpower than the girlish indecision of his face indicated. But at first, such a wave of terror came over him that for some seconds he could do nothing but stand and stare. A violent trembling ran down his back and legs, and he was conscious of a foolish, almost a hysterical impulse to scream aloud. That sigh seemed in his very ear, and the air still quivered with it. It was unmistakably a human sigh. "Who's there?" he said at length, finding his voice, but thought he meant to speak with loud decision. The tones came out instead in a faint whisper, for he had partly lost the control of his tongue and lips. He stepped forward so that he could see all round and over the kit bag. Of course, there was nothing there, nothing but the faded carpet and the bulging canvas sides. He put out his hands and threw open the mouth of the sack where it had fallen over, being only 3 parts full, and then he saw for the first time that round that round the inside, some 6 inches from the top, there ran a broad smear of dull crimson. It was an old and faded blood stain. He uttered a scream and drew back his hand as if they had been burnt. His hands as if they had been burnt. At the same moment, the kit bag gave a faint but unmistakable lurch forward towards the door. Johnson collapsed backwards, searching with his hands for the support of something solid, and the door being further behind him than he realized, received his weight just in time to prevent his falling, and shut to with a resounding bang. At the same moment, the swinging of his left arm accidentally touched the electric switch, and the light in the room went out. It was an awkward and disagreeable predicament. If Johnson had not been possessed of real pluck, he might have done all manner of foolish things. As it was, however, he pulled himself together and groped fiercely for the little brass knob to turn the light on again. But the rapid closing of the door had set the coats hanging on it a swinging, and his fingers became entangled in a confusion of sleeves and pockets, so that it was some moments before he found the switch. And in those few moments of bewilderment and terror, two things happened that sent him beyond recall over the boundary into the region of genuine horror. He distinctly heard the kit bag shuffling heavily across the floor in jerks, and close in front of his face sounded once again the sigh of a human being. In his anguished efforts to find the brass buttons on the wall, he nearly scraped the nails from his fingers, but even then, in those frenzied moments of alarm so swift and alert, are the impressions of a man keyed up by a vivid emotion. He had time to realize that he dreaded the return of the light, and that it might be better for him to stay hidden in the merciless screen of darkness. It was but the impulse of a moment, however, and before he had time to act upon it, he had yielded automatically to the original desire, and the room was again flooded with light. But the second instinct had been right. It would have been better for him to have stayed in the shelter of the kind darkness, for there close before him, bending over the half-packed kit bag, clear as life in the merciless glare of the electric light, stood the figure of John Turk, the murderer. Not 3 feet from him the man stood, the fringe of black hair marked plainly against the pallor of his forehead, the whole horrible presentment of the scoundrel, as vivid as he had seen him day after day in the Old Bailey when he stood there in the dock, cynical and callous, under the very shadow of the gallows. In a flash, Johnson realized what it all meant: the dirty and much used bag, the smear of crimson within the top, the dreadful, the dreadful stretched conditions of the bulging sides. He remembered how the victim's body had been stuffed into a canvas bag for burial, the ghastly dismembered fragments forced with lime into this very bag, and the bag itself produced as evidence. It all came back to him clear as day. Very softly and stealthily, his hand groped behind him for the handle of the door, but before he could actually turn it, the very thing that he most of all dreaded came about, and John Turk lifted his devil's face and looked at him, and at the same moment the heavy sigh passed through the air of the room, formulated somehow into words, "It's my bag and I want it." Johnson just remembered clawing the door open and then falling in a heap upon the floor of the landing as he tried frantically to make his way into the front room. He remained unconscious for a long time, and it was still dark when he opened his eyes and realized that he was lying stiff and bruised on the cold boards. Then the memory of what he had seen rushed back into his mind, and he promptly fainted again. When he woke the second time, the wintry dawn was just beginning to peep in at the windows, painting the stairs a cheerless, dismal gray, and he managed to crawl into the front room and cover himself with an overcoat in the armchair, where at length he fell asleep. A great clamor woke him. He recognized Mrs. Monk's voice, loud and voluble. What? You ain't been to bed, sir? Are you ill, or has anything happened? And there's an urgent gentleman to see you, though it ain't 7 o'clock yet, and who is it? He stammered. I'm all right, thanks. Fell asleep in my chair, I suppose. Someone from Mr. Wilbram's, and he says he ought to see you quick before you go abroad, and I told him. Show him up, please, at once, said Johnson, whose head was whirling and his mind was full of dreadful visions. Mr. Wilbram's man came in with many apologies and explained briefly and quickly that an absurd mistake had been made and the wrong kit bag had been sent over the night before. Henry somehow got a hold of the one that came over from the courtroom, and Mr. Wilbraham only discovered it when he saw his own lying in his room and asked why I had not gone to you, the man said. Oh, said Johnson stupidly. And he must have brought you the one from the murder case instead, sir, I'm afraid, the man continued, without the ghost of an expression on his face. The one John Turk packed the dead both in. Mr. Wilbraham's awful upset about it, sir, and told me to come over first thing in this morning with the right one as you were leaving by the boat. He pointed to a clean looking kit bag on the floor which he had just brought, and I was to bring the other one back, sir, he added casually. For some minutes Johnson could not find his voice. At last he pointed in the direction of his bedroom. Perhaps you would kindly unpack it for me. Just emptied the things out on the floor. The man disappeared into the other room and was gone for 5 minutes. Johnson heard the shifting to and fro of the bag and the rattle of the skates and boots being unpacked. Thank you, sir, the man said, returning with the bag folded over his arm. And can I do anything more to help you, sir? What is it? Asked Johnson, seeing that he still had something he wished to say. The man shuffled and looked mysterious. Beg pardon, sir, but knowing your interest in the Turk case, I thought you'd maybe like to know what's happened. Yes. John Turk killed himself last night with poison immediately on getting his release, and he left a note for Mr. Wilbraham saying, as he'd be much obliged if they'd had him put away, same as the woman he murdered, in the old kit bag. What time did you do it? Asked Johnson. 10 o'clock last night, sir, the warder says. The end. So, yeah, that was a really good story. I liked it. I had skimmed a little bit of it. Um, I liked it. Honestly, it reminded me of like Edgar Allan Poe, maybe mixed with like retro, like Stephen King. I enjoyed that story. Let's see. These stories are long. I did not realize how long these stories are. Um, this one I was gonna read. It doesn't have like a source, so I'm not gonna read that one, but I will include some of these in the show note descriptions. I think I'll just read one more story because these are very long stories. So I will read this one. Um, I don't know where. Okay. So this this story is called Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad. It was written by M.R. James. It first published in 1904. Let's see. Okay, I see. So yeah, another one from the 1900s. So it's Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad by M.R. James, and I'm going to read this one. Um, and then that'll be it for tonight's episode, and you can listen to this on Christmas Eve. You can listen to it on Christmas Day, anytime during the holidays, and just kind of think what it was like maybe back then to do this. I think this is a very interesting trend. Let's see. So the story begins I suppose you will be getting away pretty soon. Now full term is over, Professor, said a person not in the story to the professor of ontography, soon after they had sat down next to each other at a feast in the hospitable hall of St. James College. The professor was young, neat, and precise in speech. Yes, he said, my friends have been making me take up golf this term, and I mean to go to the East Coast, in point effect to Burnstow. I dare say you know it, for a week or 10 days, to improve my game. I hope to get off tomorrow. Oh, Parkins, said his neighbor on the other side, if you're going to Burnstow, I wish you would look at the site of the Templars' preceptory and let me know if you think it would be any good to have a dig there in the summer. It was, as you might suppose, a person of antiqu- antiquarian pursuits who said this, but since he merely appears in this prologue, there's no need to give his entitlements. Certainly, said Parkins, the professor. If you will describe to me whereabouts the site is, I'll do my best to give you an idea of the lie of the land, and when I get back, or I could write to you about it if you would tell me where you are likely to be. Don't trouble to do that, thanks. It's only that I'm thinking of taking my family in that direction in the long, and it occurred to me that as very few of the English precepti- preceptories have ever been properly planned, I might have an opportunity of doing something useful on off days. The professor rather sniffed at the idea that planning out a preceptory could be described as useful, his neighbor continued. The site, I doubt, if there's anything showing above ground, must be down quite close to the beach now. The sea has enroached tremendously, as you know, all along that bit of coast, I should think from the map, and it must be about 3/4 of a mile from the Globe Inn at the north end of the town. Where are you going to stay? Well, at the Globe Inn, as a matter of fact, said Parkins. I've engaged a room there. I couldn't get it anywhere else. Most of the lodging houses are shut up in winter, it seems, and as it is, they tell me that the only room of any size I can have is really a double-bedded one, and that they haven't a corner in which to store the other bed, and so on. But I must have a fairly large room, for I am taking some books down and mean to do a bit of work. And though I don't quite fancy having an empty bed, not to speak of two, and what I may call for the time being my study, I suppose, I can manage to rough it for the short time I shall be there. Do you call having an extra bed in your room roughing it, Parkins? Said a bluff person opposite. Look here, I shall come down and occupy it for a bit. It'll be company for you. Professor quivered, but managed to laugh in a courteous manner. By all means, Rogers, there's nothing I should like better, but I'm afraid you would find it rather dull. You don't play golf, do you? No, thank heaven, said rude Mr. Rogers. Well, you see, when I'm not writing, I shall most likely be out on the links, and that, as I say, would be rather dull for you, I'm afraid. Oh, I don't know. There's certain to be somebody I know in the place, but of course, if you don't want me, speak the word, Parkins. I shan't be offended. Truth, as you always tell us, is never offensive. Parkins was indeed scrupulously polite and strictly truthful. It is to be feared that Mr. Rogers sometimes practiced upon his knowledge of these characteristics. In Parkins' breast there was a conflict now raging, which for a moment or two did not allow him to answer. The interval being over, he said, well, if you want the exact truth, Rogers, I was considering whether the room I speak of would really be large enough to accommodate us both comfortably, and also whether, mind I shouldn't have said this if you hadn't pressed me, you would not constitute something in the nature of a hindrance to my work. Rogers laughed loudly. Well done, Parkins, he said. It's all right. I promise not to interrupt your work. Don't you disturb yourself about that. No, I won't come if you don't want me, but I thought I should do so nicely to keep the ghosts off. Here he might have been seen to wink and to nudge his next neighbor. Parkins might also have been seen to become pink. I beg pardon, Parkins, Rogers continued. I ought to have said that. I forget you don't like levity on these topics. Well, Parkins said, as you have mentioned the matter, I freely own that I do not like careless talk about what you call ghosts. A man in my position, he went on, raising his voice a little, cannot, I find, be too careful about appearing to sanction the current beliefs on such subjects. As you know, Rogers, or as you ought to know, for I think I have never concealed my views. No, you certainly have not, old man, put in Rogers sotto voce. I hold that any semblance, any appearance of concession to the view that such things might exist is equivalent to a renunciation of all that I hold most sacred, but I'm afraid I have not succeeded in securing your attention. Your undivided attention was what Dr. Blimber actually said. Rogers interrupted with every appearance of an earnest desire for accuracy. But I beg your pardon, Parkins. I'm stopping you. Not at all, said Parkins. I don't remember Blimber. Perhaps he was before my time. But I needn't go on. I'm sure you know what I mean. Yes, yes, said Rogers hastily. Just so. We'll go into it fully at Burnstow or somewhere. In repeating the dialogue, the above in repeating the above dialogue, I've tried to give the impression which it made on me that Parkins was something of an old woman, rather hen like, perhaps, in his little ways, totally destitute, alas, of the sense of humor, but at the same time dauntless and sincere in his convictions, and a man deserving of the greatest respect. Whether or not the reader has gathered so much, that was the character which Parkins had. On the following day, Parkins did as he had hoped, succeeding getting away from his college, and in arriving at Burnstow, he was made welcome at the Globe Inn, was safely installed in a large double-bedded room of which he had heard, and was able before retiring to rest, to arrange his materials for work in apple pie order upon a commodious table which occupied the outer end of the room, and was surrounded on three sides by windows looking out seaward. That is to say, the central window looked straight out to the sea, and those on the left and right commanded prospects along the shore to the north and south, respectively. On the south, you saw the village of Burnstow. On the north, no houses were to be seen, but only the beach and the low cliff backing it. Immediately in front was a strip, not considerable, of rough grass, dotted with old anchors, capstans, and so forth, then a broad path, then the beach. Whatever may have been the original distance between the Globe Inn and the sea, not more than 60 yards now separated them. The rest of the population of the inn was of course a golfing one, and included a few elements that call for a special description. The most conspicuous figure was perhaps that of an ancient militaire, secretary of a London club, and possessed of a voice of incredible strength and of views of a pronouncedly Protestant type. These were apt to find utterance after his attendance upon the ministrations of the vicar, an estimable man with inclinations toward a picturesque ritual which he gallantly kept down as far as he could out of deference to Anglian tradition. Professor Parkins, one of whose principal characteristics was pluck, spent the greater part of the day following his arrival at Burnstow, on which he had called improving his game, in company with this Colonel Wilson, and during the afternoon, whether the process of improvement were to blame or not, I am not sure. The Colonel's demeanor assumed a coloring so lurid that even Parkins jibbed at the thought of walking home with him from the links. He determined after a short and furtive look at that bristling mustache and those carnadine features, that it would be wiser to allow the influences of tea and tobacco to do what they could with the colonel before the dinner hour should render a meeting inevitable. I might walk home tonight along the beach, he reflected. Yes, and take a look. There will be light enough for that. At the ruins of which Disney was talking. I don't know exactly where they are, by the way, but I expect I can hardly help stumbling on them. I'm going to take a quick break, real quick, to get a drink of water, my voice. This he accomplished, I may say, in the most literal sense, for in picking his way from the links to the shingle beach, his foot caught partly in a gorse root and partly in a biggish stone, and over he went. When he got up and surveyed his surroundings, he found himself in a patch of somewhat broken ground covered with small depressions and mounds. These latter, when he came to examine them, proved to be simply masses of flints embedded in mortar and grown over with turf. He must, he quite rightly concluded, be on the site of the preceptory. He promised to look at it. It seemed not unlikely to reward the spade of the explorer. Enough of the foundations was probably left at no great depth to throw a good deal of light on the general plan. He remembered vaguely that the Templars, to whom the site had belonged, were in the habit of building round churches, and he thought a particular series of the humps or mounds near him did appear to be arranged in something of a circular form. Few people can resist the temptation to try a little amateur research in a department quite outside their own, if only for the satisfaction of showing how successful they would have been, only they had they taken it up seriously. Our professor, however, if he felt something of his mean desire, was also truly anxious to oblige Mr. Disney, so he paced with care the circular area he had noticed, and wrote down its rough dimensions in his pocketbook. Then he proceeded to examine an oblong eminence which lay east of the center of the circle, and seemed to his thinking likely to be the base of a platform or altar. At one end of it, the northern, a patch of the turf was gone, removed by some boy or other creature, first nature or ferae naturae. Yeah, some of these words are very Latin and Old English, so forgive me. I might, he thought, be as well to probe the soil here for evidence of masonry. And he took out his knife and began scraping away the earth. And now followed another little discovery. A portion of soil fell inward as he scraped and disclosed a small cavity. He lighted one match after another to help him to see of what nature the hole was, but the wind was too strong for them all. By tapping and scratching the sides with his knife, however, he was able to make out that it must be an artificial hole in masonry. It was rectangular in the sides, top and bottom, if not actually plastered, were smooth and regular. Of course it was empty. No. As he withdrew the knife, he heard a metallic clink, and when he introduced his hand, it met with a cylindrical object flying on the floor of the hole. Naturally enough, he picked it up, and when he brought it to the light, now fast fading, he could see that it too was of a man's making, a metal tube about 4 inches long, and evidently of some considerable age. By the time Parkins had made sure there was nothing else in the old receptacle or in the odd receptacle, it was too late and too dark for him to think of undertaking any further search. What he had done had proved so unexpectedly interesting that he determined to sacrifice a little more of the daylight on the morrow to archaeology. The object which he now had safe in his pocket was bound to be of some slight value at least, he felt sure. Bleak and solemn was the view on which he took a last look before starting homeward. A faint yellow light in the west showed the links, on which a few figures moving towards the clubhouse were still visible. The squat Martello Tower, the lights of Aldsey village, the pale ribbon of sand intersected at intervals by black wooden groins, the dim and murmuring sea. The wind was bitter from the north, but was at his back when he set out for the globe. He quickly rattled and clashed through the shingle and gained the sand, upon which, before the groins which had to be got over every few yards, the going was both good and quiet. One last look behind to measure the distance he had taken before leaving the ruined Templar's church showed him a prospect of company on his walk, in the shape of a rather indistinct personage who seemed to be making great effort to catch up with him, but made little, if any, progress. I mean that there was an appearance of running about his movements, but that the distance between him and Parkins did not seem materially to lessen. So at least Parkins thought, and decided that he almost certainly did not know him, and that it would be absurd to wait until he came. For all that company, he began to think, would really be very welcome on that lonely shore. If only you could choose your companion. In his unenlightened days, he had read of meetings in such places, which even now would hardly bear thinking of. He went on thinking of them, however, until he reached home, and particularly of one which catches most people's fancy at some time in their childhood. Now I saw in my dream that Christian had gone but a very little way when he saw a foul fiend coming over to the field to meet him. What should I do now? He thought. If I looked back and caught sight of a black figure, sharply defined against the yellow sky, and saw that it had horns and wings, I wonder whether I should stand or run for it. Luckily, the gentleman behind is not of that kind. He seems to be about as far off now as when I first saw him. Well, at this rate, he won't get his dinner as soon as I shall, and dear me, it's within a quarter of the hour of the time now. I must run. Parkins had in fact very little time for dressing. When he met the colonel at dinner, peace, or as much of her as that gentleman could manage, reigned once more in the military bosom, nor was she put to flight in the hours of bridge that followed dinner, for Parkins was a little more than a respectable player. When therefore he retired towards 12 o'clock, he felt that he had spent his evening in quite a satisfactory way, and that even for so long as a fortnight or 3 weeks, life at the Globe would be supportable under similar conditions. Especially, thought he, if I go on improving my game. As he went along the passages, he met the boots of the Globe, who stopped and said, "Beg your pardon, sir, but I was a brushing your coat just now. There was something fell out the pocket. I put it on your chest of drawers, sir, in your room. Sir, a piece of your pipe or something of that, sir. Thank you, sir. You'll find it on your chest of drawers, sir. Yes, sir. Good night, sir." The speech served to remind Parkins of his little discovery of that afternoon. It was with some considerable curiosity that he turned it over by the light of his candles. It was of bronze, he now saw, and was shaped very much after the manner of the modern dog whistle. In fact, it was, yes, certainly it was actually no more nor less than a whistle. He put it to his lip, but it was quite full of a fine, caked up sand or earth, which would not yield to knocking, but must be loosened with a knife. Hardy as ever in his habits, Parkins cleared out the earth onto a piece of paper and took the ladder to the window to empty it out. The night was clear and bright, as he saw when he had opened the casement, and he stopped for an instant to look at the sea and note a belated wanderer stationed on the shore in front of the inn. Then he shut the window, a little surprised at the late hours people kept at Burnstow, and took his whistle to the light again. Why, surely there were marks on it, and not merely marks, but letters. A very little rubbing rendered the deeply cut inscription quite legible. But the professor had to confess, after some earnest thought, that the meaning of it was as obscure to him as the writing on the wall to Belshazzar. There were legends both on the front and back of the whistle. The one thus read, "Fla fer fle bis." The other, "Quis est iste qui unit." I ought to be able to make it out, he thought, but I suppose I am a little rusty in my Latin. When I come to think of it, I don't believe I even know the word for a whistle. Long one does seem simple enough. It ought to mean, "Who is this? Who is coming?" Well, the best way to find out who is evidently to whistle for him. He blew tentatively and suddenly stopped. Startled and yet pleased at the note he had elicited, it had a quality of infinite distance in it, and soft as it was, he somehow felt it must be audible for miles around. It was a sound, too, that seemed to have the power, which many scents possess, of forming pictures in the brain. He saw quite clearly for a moment a vision of a wide, dark expanse at night, with a fresh wind blowing, and in the midst a lonely figure. How employed he could not tell. Perhaps he would have seen more had not the picture been broken by the sudden surge of a gust of wind against his casement, so sudden that it made him look up just in time to see the white glint of a seabird's wing somewhere out, outside the dark panes. The sound of the whistle had so fascinated him that he could not help trying it once more, this time more boldly. The note was little, if at all, louder than before, and repetition broke the illusion. No picture followed as he had hoped it might. But what is this goodness? What force the wind can get up in a few minutes? What a tremendous gust. There, I knew that window fastening was no use. Ah, I thought so. Both candles out. It's enough to tear the room to pieces. The first thing was to get the window shut. We might count 20. Parkins was struggling with the small casement and felt almost as if he were pushing back a sturdy burglar. So strong was the pressure. It slackened all at once, and the window banged to and latched itself. Now to relight the candles and see what damage, if any, had been done. No, nothing seemed amiss. No glass even was broken in the casement. But the noise had evidently roused at least one member of the household. The colonel was to be heard stumping in his stockinged feet on the floor above and growling. Quickly as it had risen, the wind did not fall all at once. On it went moaning and rushing past the house, at times raising a cry so desolate that, as Parkins disinterestedly said, it might have made fanciful people feel quite uncomfortable, even the unimaginable. Sorry, I lost my spot. Hold on. Sorry. Unimaginable. Oh, where there was a Yeah, sorry. Whether it was the wind or the excitement of golf, or the researchers in the preceptory that kept Parkins awake, he was not sure. Awake he remained in any case long enough to fancy, as I'm afraid I often do myself under such conditions, that he was the victim of all manner of fatal disorders. He would lie counting the beats of his heart, convinced that it was going to stop work every moment, and would entertain grave suspicion of his lungs, brain, liver, etc. Suspicions which he was sure would be dispelled by the return of daylight, but which until then refused to put aside. He found a little vicarious comfort in the idea that someone else was in the same boat. A near neighbor in the darkness, it was not easy to tell his direction, was tossing and wrestling in his bed too. The next stage was that Parkins shut his eyes and determined to give sleep every chance. Here again, overexcitement asserted itself in another form, that of making pictures. Experto crede. Pictures do come to the closed eyes of one trying to sleep, and are often so little to his taste that he must open his eyes and disperse them. Parkman's experience on this occasion was a very distressing one. He found that the picture which presented itself to him was continuous. When he opened his eyes, of course, it went, but when he shut them once more, it framed itself afresh and acted itself out again. Neither quicker nor slower than before, what he saw was this long stretch of shore, shingle edged by sand and intersected at short intervals with black groins running down the water. A scene, in fact, so like that of his afternoon's walk, that in the absence of any landmark it cannot be distinguished therefrom. The light was obscure, conveying an impression of gathering storm, late winter evening and slight cold rain. On this bleak stage at first no actor was visible. Then in the distance a bobbing black object appeared. A moment more, and it was a man running, jumping, clambering over the groins, and every few seconds looking eagerly back. The nearer he came, the more obvious it was that he was not only anxious, but even terribly frightened. Though his face was not to be distinguished, he was moreover almost at the end of his strength. On he came. Each successive obstacle seemed to cause him more difficulty than the last. Will he get over this one? Thought Parkins. It seems a little higher than the others. Yes, half climbing, half throwing himself, he did get over, and fell all in a heap on the other side, the side nearest to the spectator. There, as if really unable to get up again, he remained crouching under the groin, looking up in an attitude of painful anxiety. So far, no cause whatever the fear of the runner had been shown. Another began to be seen far up the shore, a little flicker of something light colored, moving to and fro with great swiftness and irregularity. Rapidly growing larger, it too declared itself as a figure in pale, fluttering draperies ill defined. There was something about its motion which made Parkins very unwilling to see it at close quarters. It would stop, raise arms, bow itself toward the sand, then run stooping across the beach to the water edge and back again, and then rising upright once more, continue its course forward at a speed that was startling and terrifying. The moment came when the pursuer was hovering about from left to right only a few yards beyond the groin where the runner lay in hiding. After two or three ineffectual castings hither and thither, it came to a stop, stood upright with arms raised high, and then darted straight forward towards the groin. It was at this point that Parkins always failed in his resolution to keep his eyes shut. With many misgivings as to incipient failure of eyesight, overworked brain, excessive smoking, and so on, he finally resigned himself to light his candle, get out a book, and pass the night walking, rather than be tormented by the persistent panorama, which he saw clearly enough could only be a morbid reflection of his walk and his thoughts on that very day. The scraping of match on box and the glare of light must have startled some creatures of the night, rats or what not, which he heard scurry across the floor from the side of his bed with much rustling. Dear, dear, the match is out. Fool that it is. But the second one burnt better, and a candle and book were duly procured, over which Parkins pored till sleep of a wholesome kind came upon him, and that it no longer space. For about the first time in his orderly and prudent life, he forgot to blow out the candle, and when he was called the next morning at 8, there was still a flicker in the socket and a sad mess of guttered grease on the top of the little table. After breakfast, he was putting After breakfast, he was in his room putting the finishing touches to his golfing costume. Fortune had again allotted the colonel to him for a partner when one of the maids came in. "Oh, if you please," she said, "would you like any blankets on your bed, sir?" "Ah, thank you," said Parkins. "Yes, I should like one. I think I should like one. It seems likely to turn rather colder." In a very short time the maid was back with the blanket. "Which bed should I put it on, sir?" she asked. "What? Why, that one, the one I slept in last night," he said, pointing to it. "Oh, yes, I beg your pardon, sir, but you seem to have tried both of them. Leastways, we had to make them both up this morning." "Really? How very absurd," said Parkins. "I certainly never touched the other except to lay some things on it. Did it actually seem to have been slept in?" "Oh, yes, sir," said the maid. "Why, all the things were crumpled and thrown about all ways. You'll excuse me, sir, quite as if anyone hadn't passed but a very poor night, sir." "Dear me," said Parkins. "Well, I may have disordered it more than I thought when I unpacked my things. I'm very sorry to give you the extra trouble. I'm sure I expect a friend of mine soon, by the way, a gentleman from Cambridge, to come and occupy it for a night or two. That'll be all right, I suppose, won't it?" "Oh, yes, to be sure, sir. Thank you, sir. It's no trouble, I'm sure," said the maid, and departed to giggle with her colleagues. Parkins set forth with a stern determination to improve his game. I am glad to be able to report that he succeeded so far in this enterprise that the colonel, who had been rather repining at the prospect of a second day's play in his company, became quite chatty as the morning advanced, and his voice boomed out over the flats, as certain also of our own minor poets have said, like some great Borden in a minster tower. "Extraordinary wind that we had last night," he said. "In my old home we should have said someone had been whistling for it." "Should you indeed?" said Parkins. "Is there a superstition of that kind still current in your part of the country?" "I don't know about superstition," said the colonel. "They believe in it all over Denmark and Norway, as well on the Yorkshire coast. And my experience is, mind you, that there's generally something at the bottom of what these country folk hold to, and have held to for generations. But it's your drive, or whatever it might have been." The golfing reader will have to imagine appropriate digression at the proper intervals. When conversation was resumed, Parkins said with a slight hesitancy, "Apropos, apropos of what you were saying just now, Colonel, I think I ought to tell you my own views on such subjects are very strong. I am in fact a convinced disbeliever in what is called the supernatural." "What?" said the Colonel. "Do you mean to tell me you don't believe in second sight or ghosts or anything of that kind?" "Nothing whatever of that kind," returned Parkins firmly. "Well," said the colonel, "but it appears to me at that rate, sir, that you must be a little better than a Sadducee." Parkins was on the point of answering that, in his opinion, the Sadducees were the most sensible persons he had ever read of in the Old Testament, but feeling some doubt as to whether much mention of them was to be found in that work, he preferred to laugh the accusation off. "Perhaps I am," he said, "but here, give me my clique, boy. Excuse me one moment, Colonel." A short interval. "Now, as to whistling for the wind, let me give you my theory about it. The law, the laws which govern winds are really not at all perfectly known. To fisher folk and such, of course, not known at all. A man or woman of eccentric habits, perhaps, or a stranger is seen repeatedly on the beach at some unusual hour and is heard whistling. Soon afterwards a violent wind rises. A man who could read the sky perfectly, or who possessed a barometer, could have foretold that it would. The simple people of a fishing village have no barometers and only a few rough rules for prophesying weather. What more natural than the eccentric personage postulated should be regarded as having raised the wind, or that he or she should clutch eagerly at the reputation of being able to do so? Now take last night's wind as it happens. I myself was whistling. I blew a whistle twice, and the wind seemed to come absolutely in answer to my call if anyone has seen me. The audience had been a little restive under this harangue, and Parkins had, I fear, fallen somewhat into the tone of a lecturer. But at that last sentence the colonel stopped. "Whistling, were you?" he said. "And what sort of whistle did you use? Play the stroke first." Interval. About that whistle you were asking, Colonel. It's a rather curious one. I have it in my No, I see I've left it in my room. As a matter of fact, I found it yesterday." And then Parkins narrated the manner of his discovery of the whistle, upon hearing which the Colonel grunted and opined that in Parkins' place he should he he should himself be careful about using a thing that had belonged to a set of papists, of course, or of whom, speaking generally, it might be affirmed that you never knew what they might not have been up to. From this topic, he diverged to the enormities of the vicar, who had given notice on the previous Sunday the 1st would be the feast of St. Thomas the Apostle, and that there would be service at 11 o'clock in the church. This and other similar proceedings constituted, in the colonel's view, a strong presumption that the vicar was a concealed papist, if not a Jesuit, and Parkins, who could not very readily follow the colonel in this region, did not disagree with him. In fact, they got on so well together in the morning that there was no talk on either side of their separating after lunch. Both continued to play well during the afternoon, or at least well enough to make them forget everything else until the light began to fail them. Not until then did Parkins remember that he had meant to do more investigating at the preceptory, but it was of no great importance, he reflected. One day was as good as another. Well, he might as well go home with the colonel. As they turned the corner of the house, the colonel was almost knocked down by a boy who rushed him at the very top of his speed, and then instead of running away, remained hanging on to him and panting. The first words of the warrior were naturally those of reproof and objurgation, but he very quickly discerned that the boy was almost speechless with fright. Inquiries were useless at first. When the boy got his breath, he began to howl and still clung to the colonel's legs. He was at last detached, but continued to howl. What in the world is the matter with you? What have you been up to? What have you seen? Said the two men. "Oh, I seen it with at me out the winder," wailed the boy, "and I don't like it." "What window?" said the colonel. "Please, come, pull yourself together, my boy. The front winder it was at the hotel," said the boy. At this point, Parkins was in favor of sending the boy home, but the colonel refused. He wanted to get to the bottom of it. He said it was most dangerous to give a boy such a fright as this one had, and if it turned out that people had been playing jokes, they should suffer for it in some way. And by a series of questions, he made out the story. The boy had been playing about on the grass in front of the globe with some others. Then they had gone home to their teas, and he was just going when he happened to look up at the front window and seen it a wiving at him. It seemed to be a figure of some sort in white as far as he knew. Couldn't see its face, but it waved at him, and it wasn't a right thing. Not to say not a right person. Was there a light in the room? No, he didn't think to look if there was a light. Which was the window? Was it the top or the second one? The second one it was. The big window, what got two little ends at the sides. Very well, my boy, said the colonel after a few more questions. You run away home now. I expect it was some person trying to give you a start. Another time, like a brave English boy, you just throw a stone. Well, no, not that exactly, but you go and speak to the waiter or to Mr. Simpson, the landlord. And yes, and say that I advised you to do so. The boy's face expressed some of the doubt he felt to the likelihood of Mr. Simpson's lending a favorable ear to his complaint, but the colonel did not appear to perceive this and went on. And here's a sixpence. No, I see it's a shilling, and you be off home and don't think any more about it. The youth hurried off with agitated thanks, and the colonel and Parkins went round to the front of the globe and reconnoitred. I've never heard that word before. There's only one window answering to the description they had been hearing. "Well, that's curious," said Parkins. "It's evidently my window the lad was talking about. Will you come up for a moment, Colonel Wilson? We ought to be able to see if anyone has been taking liberties in my room." They were soon in the passage, and Parkins made as if to open the door. Then he stopped and felt in his pockets. "This is more serious than I thought," was his next remark. "I remember now that before I got started this morning, I locked the door. It is locked now, and what is more, here is the key," and he held it up. Now he went on, "If the servants are in the habit of going into one's room during the day when one is away, I can only say that, well, I don't approve of it at all." Conscious of a somewhat weak climax, he busied himself in opening the door, which was indeed locked, and in lighting candles. "No," he said, "nothing seems disturbed." "Except your bed," put in the colonel. "Excuse me, that isn't my bed," said Parkins. "I don't use that one, but it does look as if someone has been playing tricks with it." It certainly did. The clothes were bundled up and twisted together in a most torturous confusion, Parkins pondered. "That must be it," he said at last. "I disordered the clothes last night in unpacking, and they haven't made it since. Perhaps they came in to make it, and that boy saw them through the window, and then they were called away and locked the door after them. Yes, I think that must be it." "We'll ring and ask," said the colonel, and this appeal to Parkins as practical. The maid appeared, and to make a long story short, deposed that she had made the bed in the morning when the gentleman was in the room, and hadn't been there since. No, she had no other key. Mr. Simpson, he kept the keys. He'd be able to tell the gentleman if anyone had been up. This was a puzzle. Investigation showed that nothing of value had been taken, and Parkins remembered the disposition of the small objects on tables and so forth well enough to be pretty sure that no pranks had been played with them. Mr. and Mrs. Simpson furthermore agreed that neither of them had given the duplicate key of the room to any person whatever during the day, nor could Parkins, fair-minded man as he was, detect anything in the demeanor of master, mistress, or maid that indicated guilt. He was much more inclined to think that the boy had been imposing on the colonel. The latter was unwontedly silent and pensive at dinner and throughout the evening. When he bade good night to Parkins, he murmured in a gruff undertone, "Know where I am if you want me during the night." "Why, yes, thank you, Colonel Wilson, I think I do. But there isn't much prospect of my disturbing you, I hope. By the way," he added, "did I share that old whistle I spoke of? I think not. Well, here it is." The Colonel turned it over gingerly in the light of the candle. "Can you make anything of the inscription?" asked Parkins, as he took it back. "No, not in this light. What do you mean to do with it?" "Oh, well, when I get back to Cambridge, I shall submit it to some of the archaeologists there, and see what they think of it, and very likely, if they consider it worth having, I may present it in one of the museums." Said the Colonel. "Well, you may be right. All I know is that if it were mine, I should chuck it straight into the sea. It's no use talking, I'm well aware, but I expect that you and that with you it's a case of live and learn. I hope so, I'm sure, and wish you a good night." He turned away, leaving Parkins in act to speak at the bottom of the stair, and soon each was in his own bedroom. Let's see. By some unfortunate accident, there were neither blinds nor curtains in the windows of the professor's room. The previous night he had thought little of this, but tonight there seemed every prospect of a bright moon rising to shine directly on his bed, and probably wake him later on. When he noticed this, he was a good deal annoyed, but with an ingenuity which I can only envy, he succeeded in rigging up, with the help of a railway rug, some safety pins, and a stick and umbrella, a screen which, if only held together, would completely keep the moonlight off his bed. And shortly afterwards, he was comfortable in that bed. When he read a somewhat solid work long enough to produce a decided wish for sleep, he cast a drowsy look round the room, blew out the candle, and fell back upon the pillow. He must have slept soundly for an hour or more, when a sudden clatter shook him up in a most unwelcome manner. In a moment he realized what had happened. His carefully constructed screen had given way, and a very bright, frosty moon was shining directly on his face. This was highly annoying. Could he possibly get up and reconstruct the screen, or could he manage to sleep if he did not? For some minutes he lay and pondered over the possibilities. Then he turned over sharply and with all his eyes open lay breathlessly listening. There had been a movement, he was sure, in the empty bed on the opposite side of the room. Tomorrow he would have it moved. There must be rats or something playing about in it. It was quiet now. No, the commotion began again. There was a rustling and shaking, surely more than any rat could cause. I can figure to myself something of the professor's bewilderment and horror, for I have in a dream 30 years back seen the same thing happen. But the reader will hardly perhaps imagine how dreadful it was to him to see a figure suddenly sit up in what he had known was an empty bed. He was out of his own bed in one bound, and made a dash towards the window where lay his only weapon, the stick with which he had propped his screen. This was, as it turned out, the worst thing he could have done, because the personage in the empty bed, with a sudden smooth motion, slipped from the bed and took up a position with outspread arms between the two beds and in front of the door. Parkins watched it in a horrid perplexity. Somehow the idea of getting past it and escaping through the door was intolerable to him. He could not have borne, he didn't know why, to touch it. And for its touching him, he would sooner dash himself through the window than have that happen. It stood for the moment in a band of dark shadow, and he had not seen what its face was like. Now it began to move in a stooping posture, and all that the spectator realized, with some horror and some relief, that it must be blind, for it seemed to feel about with its muffled arms in a groping and random fashion. Turning half away from him, it became suddenly conscious of the bed he had just left, and darted towards it and bent over and felt the pillows in a way which made Parkins shudder, as he had never in his life thought it possible. In a very few moments it seemed to know that the bed was empty, and then moving forward into the area of light and facing the window, it showed for the first time what manner of thing it was. Parkins, who very much dislikes being questioned about it, did once describe something of it in my hearing, and I gathered that when he chiefly remembers about it is a horrible and intensely horrible face of crumpled linen. What expression he read upon it he could not or would not tell, but the fear of it went nigh to maddening him is certain. But he was not at leisure to watch it for long. With formidable quickness it moved into the middle of the room, and as it groped and waved, one corner of its drapery swept across Parkin's face. He could not, though he knew not how perilous the sound was, he could not keep back a cry of disgust, and this gave the searcher an instant clue. It leapt towards him upon the instant, and the next moment he was halfway through the window backwards, uttering cry upon cry at the utmost pitch of his voice, and the linen face was thrust close into his own. At this almost the last possible second, deliverance came, as you will have guessed. The colonel burst the door open and was just in time to see the dreadful group at the window. When he reached the figures, only one was left. Parkin sank forward into the room in a faint, and before him, on the floor, lay a tumbled heap of bedclothes. Colonel Wilson asked no questions, but busied himself in keeping everyone else out of the room and getting Parkins back to his bed, and himself, wrapped in a rug, occupied the other bed for the rest of the night. Early on the next day, Rogers arrived, more welcome than he would have been a day before, and the three of them held a very long consultation in the professor's room. At the end of it, the colonel left the hotel door carrying a small object between his finger and thumb, which he cast as far into the sea as a very brawny man could send it. Later on, the smoke of a burning ascended from the back premise of the Globe. Exactly what explanation was patched up for the staff and visitors at the hotel, I must confess I do not recollect. The professor was somehow cleared of the reedy suspicion of delirium tremens, and the hotel of the reputation of a troubled house. There is not much question as to what would have happened to Parkins if the colonel had not intervened when he did. He would either have fallen out of the window or else lost his wits. But it is not so evident what more the creature that came in answer to the whistle could have done than frighten. There seemed to be absolutely nothing material about it save the bedclothes, of which it had made itself a body. The colonel, who remembered a not very dissimilar occurrence in India, was of opinion that if Parkins had closed with it could have done very little, and that its one power was that of frightening. The whole thing, he said, served to confirm his opinion of the Church of Rome. There was really nothing more to tell. But as you may imagine, the professor's views on certain points are less clear cut than they used to be. His nerves, too, have suffered. He cannot even now see a surplice hanging on a door quite unmoved, and the spectacle of a scarecrow in a field late on a winter afternoon has cost him more than one sleepless night. That one was okay. I I kind of had trouble um, reading that one. The old English words were kind of bad, and the spelling was kind of difficult. Um, Yeah, and honestly, that one kinda started out kinda boring to me, but at the end, it got good, so, thank you for listening to these 2 ghost stories. Um, expect more episodes in January. I'm not sure what I wanna talk about yet. I'm gonna think about that during my winter break from work and just other stuff and figure out what I wanna do, what topics I wanna cover. If there's topics you wanna hear me cover, go ahead and, email me um, haydencrook8@gmail.com. I hope you enjoyed the episode of Ghosts, Demons, and Murder. Oh my. And I'll see you guys in 2024 for the next year. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, and all that. And thank you for listening.